So welcome to our February Web Debate. And this month we are looking at Arctic diplomacy. As many of you who attend know, we organize these Web Debates in the context of the International Forum on Diplomatic Training. They take place once a month on the first Tuesday of the month. What we do is we look at various aspects of diplomatic practice and give advice, or aim to give advice, for the next generation of diplomats. My name is Katharina Höhne. I'm a researcher and lecturer with DiploFoundation, and I have the pleasure to moderate this debate. So this is the first debate in the new year, so I would like to say a particularly warm welcome to everyone. But warm also because today we're looking at a topic that takes us to a polar region. So we're looking at Arctic diplomacy, and for me, when I hear Arctic diplomacy, I immediately understand the Arctic as a place and an object of diplomacy and diplomatic practice. And today we will basically use the topic as a lens through which to explore different diplomatic practices, different approaches, and in fact different types of diplomacy. We have three guest experts, and all of them study the Arctic from a different perspective. And I think it will be very instructive, not just to hear these different variations, but to also see where are synergies and where are connections between them. So just to briefly introduce our experts, we have with us Professor Paul Berkman, who is Professor of Practice in Science Diplomacy at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Hello, Paul. Thanks for being with us. We have Dr. Danita Burke, who is Marie Curie Individual Fellow at the Center for War Studies at the University of Southern Denmark. And we have Dr. André Saramago, who is Assistant Professor of International Relations at Coimbra University and researcher with the Orient Institute. So just as a reminder for those who are listening in, we aim to have this debate as interactive as possible. So please don't hold back with your questions and your comments. You can type them here in the chat window, and I will look at them, I will collect them, and I will relate them back to our three guest experts for their answers and their comments. So keep that in mind as we get underway, because your questions and comments will be really important to keep this debate going and to see what different directions we actually should be exploring. Because our three experts come from different perspectives, what we agreed is that each of them has a short amount of time to introduce their particular perspective on the Arctic and on Arctic diplomacy. So what I will do now is hand over the floor to them to give us a sense of what their research looks like and what their key concerns are regarding the region. So we will start with Danita, followed by Paul, and then last but not least, André. And I think without further ado, I will give the floor to Danita to give us a sense of how she approaches the Arctic and what that means for her. So over to you, Danita.
Thank you very much. So my work has focused primarily from an international relations, international politics perspective, and I've looked at key themes in my research to date. These themes have primarily been about diplomacy and cooperation, non-governmental organizations, and identity. And as the slideshow presents, there's just a sample of some of the types of publications that I've done on these topics. For me, I've pursued research of the Arctic region for many years now, and it's because I've always found it particularly interesting and dynamic in a way that it speaks to me that other topics and parts of the world haven't. There is a uniqueness about the Arctic region, but also a similarity about the Arctic region to many other parts of the world, which make it quite a dynamic area of study and quite an important area for our broader understanding of international relations and diplomacy more generally. In many respects, some of the uniqueness about the Arctic region are often spoken to about the climate and the impact of those conditions on the way that politics have operated. But there's also the importance of the indigenous peoples that live there. There are growing levels of autonomy, and their important role and unique input into the way that diplomacy has been evolving in the Arctic region, which really makes the Arctic region stand out. The Arctic Council, for example, is a preeminent area for focus of seeing how the Arctic Council and the Arctic region have been unique. And as such, this is something that I have focused quite a bit of my more recent research on, including a book that I have forthcoming with McGill Queen's University Press, Diplomacy and the Arctic Council, which really delves into these different dynamics. And I think as such, the Arctic region is a fascinating part of the world that I have devoted much of my time to date exploring within the context of international relations. And I think it's very important for us to continue to focus and to look at this region for both what is happening regionally, but also the broader implications of what is happening regionally on broader international relations and diplomacy. Also, as an extension of this, I have started the Women in the Arctic, the WIA initiative. And this initiative is something that I think is particularly important for helping to highlight the role that women are playing in growing scholarship, which is sometimes underrepresented. And there are a number of fascinating and very useful initiatives that other women have started in the Arctic region, and I take my hat off to them. But there's also a need for acknowledging just basic networking, information sharing from different experts and people of different levels of education, different levels of input from the different parts of both the Arctic region and people who study and visit the Arctic region and are guests there as part of their research. And if you visit the Women in the Arctic website, which is womeninthearctic.ca, you can find out some very fascinating information about women who have done research from different fields of research, from biology to marine sciences, international relations, and architecture. And you can go there and you can learn about them. You can see some of their samples of their different publications and just spread the news, because there are plenty of people besides myself who are doing fantastic scholarship in the Arctic region, and we need to spread the word. So please visit the womeninthearctic.ca website and learn about these different women who have been doing excellent research in the Arctic region and spread the news. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Danita. And I think with this focus on individuals doing research in the Arctic, I think this is a very good connection to what I presume Paul might be talking about from his science diplomacy angle. So,
Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, good. Recognizing this is about the Arctic is in a global context, so my brief remarks at the beginning will be related to the global context. The changes that we're seeing in the Arctic are threshold changes. We have a new Arctic Ocean. In the past, the sea ice had covered the ocean, and today more than half of the Arctic Ocean is open water during the summer. It's not a matter of when the Arctic ice retreats all the way. It's a new system today. As a consequence, there's increased interest in shipping and in resources in the ocean, in activities in infrastructure development. And it's estimated, for example, by the World Economic Forum that something on the order of $1 trillion of investment will mature in the Arctic over the coming decades. My sense of this situation is that the changes that we're seeing in the environment with sea ice and permafrost are, in a sense, trivial compared to the lasting changes that will occur when infrastructure is developed. The challenge isn't no infrastructure. The challenge is how to build it in a thoughtful way that will serve the interests of future generations. And it's in that longer context of time that I'd like to offer some observations. This chart in front of you shows the the history of global human population growth from the Treaty of Westphalia that was in 1648 that established the nation state. Since that period, global human population size has increased more than 1,000%. So in context, the oldest calendars on Earth are around 6,000 years. 6,000 years is 60 centuries, and so we're basically looking at the last 3 or 4 centuries of prominent change in the global human population, unprecedented across 60 centuries. And in effect, we're just in our infancy as a globally interconnected civilization. So understanding those global interconnections is part of the challenge, the Arctic included. And so if we go through 1800, in 1800 we had the first billion people alive on Earth around at the same time. Cities began to emerge, need to industrialize. Second, in the 20th century, we had 2 world wars. These were accompanied by increasing population size. We reached 2 billion people. The industrialization, in a sense, the technology, the science behind that enabled that global conflict. Now we're in a digital revolution. All kinds of new changes. Again, science, technology, innovation influencing the development of the world. So we've gone from less than 1 billion people during the Treaty of Westphalia to almost 8 billion at the end of this decade on Earth. At the same time, we see changes in the global atmosphere in terms of carbon dioxide, which is globally distributed. And they parallel very closely the relation to human population size. And just without getting into any discussions about what the causes and so on are, it's clear that there's a symbiosis between the two, and recognizing that correlation alone does not mean causation. So not ascribing any particular reason. The nature is that we live in a globally interconnected civilization. So next slide, please. Okay. In this context, these are mega cities, the red circles. Mega cities are cities larger than 10 million people. And in a sense, to respond to global challenges means solutions that operate from global to local scales and local to global scales. The Arctic is a good example in terms of nations and the world balancing their interests. In this slide, which the slide disappeared, unfortunately, part of it, but that's okay, I'll talk to it. There are different types of jurisdictions. The centerpiece of jurisdictions are nations. Since the Treaty of Westphalia. But after the World Wars, the first one with the League of Nations, the second one with the United Nations, international institutions were developed. And so we have international institutions in the world. And with the growth of cities like megacities, where 10 million people live in an urban area, the development and progress of subnational jurisdictions is also maturing. And so the challenge that we face, in a sense, is how to connect and respond on a planetary scale from local to global and global to local. Next slide, please. So in this process, there is the concept of an informed decision. I think that all of us in the aspirations we have for our leaders of our societies want them to make informed decisions. And so the question is, what is an informed decision? An informed decision operates across a continuum of urgencies, from the present, which is immediate in terms of security timescales, risks of political, economic, and cultural instability, and over generations in terms of sustainability timescales, balancing economic, environmental, and societal well-being. How do we traverse it? How do we develop informed decisions? And so I'm not going to be able to go into this completely here, but just to suffice that the solutions are international, they are interdisciplinary, and they are inclusive. Inclusive in terms of the representation of the various stakeholders, inclusive of the time periods that are involved, the present as well as the future, inclusive of the different methodologies. And in this sense, science can be considered as the study of change. Change is studied differently with the natural sciences and the social sciences, even indigenous knowledge, but they all characterize patterns and trends. And those patterns and trends become the bases for decisions. And so a broad umbrella that is inclusive, that is international, and that is interdisciplinary, in thinking about what science is and how it contributes to the world, is to consider science broadly as the study of change, to include the natural sciences, indigenous knowledge, and social sciences. And so it is with science diplomacy, in terms of a tool to build common interests among allies and adversaries alike at different scales, from nations to individuals, that this methodology that is illustrated here operates. I don't have time, I don't think, in my opening remarks to go into this, but I just appreciate the opportunity that the DiploFoundation and Katharina are providing to have this type of discussion, and look forward to interesting remarks from both Danita and André. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Again, very different perspective, and I think without further ado, let's jump to André and our third perspective on the Arctic.
Thank you very much, Katrina. Actually, building up a bit on what Paul has just presented in a way. So my focus, my research focus so far has been mainly on international relations theory on the one hand and East Asian studies on the other. And how these two are brought together is actually by my interest in political ideologies and how they frame states' foreign policies, namely. And I've done some research focused on the Arctic with Danita, more specifically on how Singapore's approach to the Arctic is in line with its approach to the wider region of Southeast Asia. My interest here, and where I think my approach can pick up on what Paul just said, is that it's interesting because usually when we talk about the Arctic, we talk, more recently especially, we talk a lot about the resources that are there, the shipping routes, and so on. And so the geopolitical dimension of this issue, right? While, as Paul just mentioned, one of the big dimensions, and Danita has mentioned it as well, of several countries' engagement and interest in the Arctic is actually on scientific matters, so on scientific research, right? And one of the interesting things that I would like to pick up on this, and in order to connect with the recent and rising Asian interest in the Arctic, is that looking at a lot of these countries, Asian countries, who are increasingly trying to engage with the Arctic, the main avenue of that engagement is actually through science and through science diplomacy. So science diplomacy is the initial steps towards their engagement with the Arctic, right? And just what I would like to talk here, and just to be brief and not overextend so that we can move on to the discussion, is that this science is frequently looked at as a way of exercising soft power in the region to a certain extent. But also I would say that it actually might have a deeper connection with the interests and even the domestic orders of some of these Asian countries. And I would just like to pinpoint to China's example to illustrate this. So in January of 2018, actually, China released a white paper on its Arctic policy that Danita was kind enough to discuss with me recently. And the main focus of China, of course, China talks about the resources and about its interest in the shipping routes and so on, but the main focus of China is on scientific research in the Arctic, okay? Exactly arising from this idea that China is a near Arctic state, and what China means by this is that China's domestic environment, in terms of China's domestic ecological conditions and climate conditions and so on, are deeply influenced by the development of the environment in the Arctic. So global warming and the changes it is bringing in the Arctic are directly affecting rain patterns in China, which affects agriculture and so on, which has a strong impact on China's economy. So China's arguments about being a near Arctic state and its interests in the Arctic have to do with this direct relation between what is going on in the Arctic and what is going on climatically and ecologically within China, within China's own territorial space. So to a very significant extent, China is interested and is constantly emphasizing this aspect on conducting research, science and climate research in the Arctic in order to understand this connection between what's going on in the Arctic and its own conditions at home. Now, the interesting thing, and this is the connection that I wanted to make, is that it is important to look at this, to look at this relation of China with science in the Arctic, not only as a tool of soft power through which China is trying to extend its influence abroad, but also in the way that the Arctic is also influencing China's own internal and domestic policies and China's own understanding of what adequate climate policies should be like. So there is strong evidence that the research being conducted in the Arctic is directly influencing China's recent green turn in an extent, and the recent development of China's conception of ecological civilization. Right? So China's concept of ecological civilization is the answer that China is trying to provide to the decades of opening up and developing economically, which have had its significant toll in environmental terms in China. Right? We all have heard about the problems with water pollution and air pollution and so on. And so recently, since 2015, China has actually inscribed in its 5-year plans and in its constitution the objective of creating an ecological civilization. Now, there's a whole discussion about how this conception of ecological civilization is framed in China's Marxist-Leninist ideology, in the sense that ecological civilization is portrayed as actually a post-capitalist and post-industrial stage of the civilization. So China is now advancing to a beyond what the West has reached in terms of civilizational development. What is interesting is that the knowledge that is being gathered in the Arctic is directly influencing how China conceives of what an ecological civilization should look like. Right? Now, what is interesting in this regard is that, and this is something that I've been presenting recently and some research that I'm developing at this moment, is that China's conception of ecological civilization is not only for internal consumption, but is also a way of China promoting itself abroad. So the idea of ecological civilization is portrayed within China as actually a very significant alternative to the typical liberal environmentalism of the West. Okay? While liberal environmentalism is very much focused on consumption and on the idea that citizens as private consumers have a moral responsibility to address ecological change and to try to consume green so that we lower our impact on the environment, the idea of ecological civilization is one that actually reinforces the responsibility of the state and companies to act in an environmentally mindful way. And the way that this is being carried out in China is actually trying to inaugurate a new relation between state, private companies, and the environment, which is something that we do not witness in the West. And actually, China's argument is that what is being cultivated in China is what they call embedded market socialism. And this idea of embedded market socialism means that in big companies, for example, there is usually a cell of the Communist Party within the company itself. And the role of that cell of the Communist Party is not to dictate how the company should act, but to inform the company of whether or not its activities are in line with the country's legal standards, namely in what concerns environmental protection. Okay? And so several authors have talked about how actually what we are witnessing in China is an alternative to liberal environmentalism and the kind of authoritarian environmentalism, according to some authors. But what is interesting is that China's argument is that this type of different relation between the state and the private sector is actually the key to inaugurate ecological civilization within China. Okay? More recently, China has actually started to portray ecological civilization as something that humanity as a whole can learn from. Okay? So the idea of advancing an ecological civilization has been something that China has defended at the level of the UN quite strongly, and with some success even, to the extent that the UN Environmental Programme Governing Council, for example, has actually adopted the concept of ecological civilization. The same thing to NGOs like the UN Alliance of Civilizations, who are actually adopting the concept of ecological civilization and using them in their own promotion of more environmentally mindful behavior. Now, this translation, sorry.
André, can I stop you there?
No, of course.
Is it okay if I stop you there? Do you have a final point you want to make, and then we can maybe go into
this attempt by China to promote ecological civilization abroad has been using some key words and some key concepts, such as the attempt to build a community of shared future for humankind. And this is exactly how China now portrays its own engagement with the Arctic. So engaging with the Arctic is part of China's attempt to build a community of shared future for humankind. What I mean is that Arctic scientific research by China on the one hand is influencing China's internal environmental policies, but on the other hand, the whole environmental discourse that China is building internally and portraying as an alternative to the West is also starting to seep in to its discourse about its engagement with the Arctic. So to a very significant extent, there's a link here between China's engagement with the Arctic and a wider, I would say even ideological competition with the West, which is not only centered around military or economic issues, but even in terms of environmentalism and how China portrays its role in combating climate change and in proposing alternatives to the usual West approach to these topics. So, sorry if I went too long.
No, thank you. That was extremely interesting because as all the contributions, it opened up a very different, like a very broad perspective in the sense that we have long-term issues, we have short-term issues that need to be brought into dialogue with each other, questions of national interest, questions of science diplomacy that then feed back into national interest. Looking at the questions, actually I think it's a good moment to kind of take a couple of steps back and answer some basic questions, or what we could call basic questions on the Arctic and Arctic diplomacy. So when Danita introduced her research, she mentioned the Arctic Council. And when we were talking, we were also talking about near-Arctic states and not near-Arctic states. So Danita, since you're the core researcher that focuses on the Arctic, maybe you can give us a bit of an introduction on these things. So what is the Arctic Council? What are the key states that are bordering the Arctic? And
so the Arctic Council is one of a number of different forums which exist in the Arctic region. You also have other ones like the Arctic Circle, for example. But the Arctic Council has been around since 1996. It is a continuation of the building of Arctic cooperation, which had started previously in the 80s at the Murmansk speech by Gorbachev. And building upon that, we started with the Finnish initiative, in which Finland really seized upon Gorbachev's call for regional cooperation in the Arctic region, took that ball, ran with it, and developed the first stage of regional cooperation, which was the AEPS, the Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy. And then building upon that came then the Canadian initiative, which then in the 1990s developed into what is present day the Arctic Council. Now the Arctic Council has been around for 20 plus years, and it focuses on environmental protection and sustainable economic development. That's a broad mandate, but what its real focus and what its real added benefit is that it opens up an area for dialogue in the Arctic region. And what really makes it different from other parts of the world is two key factors. One is that despite common perceptions that, the West doesn't talk very much with Russia, in the Arctic Council, Russia is actually a central player with the other 7 Arctic coastal states. And the 7 states are Russia, the United States because of Alaska, Canada, the Kingdom of Denmark, which includes Denmark proper, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands. Then you've got Sweden, Norway, and Finland and Iceland. So amongst these states, they make up the core membership of the permanent Arctic states. Though they don't take the label permanent, they're just the Arctic coastal and non-coastal states of the Arctic states. The other key unique factor to the Arctic Council is the central role of the permanent participants. Now, the permanent participants are indigenous peoples represented in the Arctic region, and there are 6 permanent participants. And they have a permanent place, which really puts them in an ideal place of being able to speak freely without fear of a loss of position. And this opens up an avenue for indigenous people to have a direct access to key decision makers and scientists, but also an outlet to express their interest about their homelands. The third level of members in the Arctic Council are the observers. Now, the observers is made up of three groups. There are the states, the IGOs and parliamentary groups, and the NGOs. Now, this has been growing a lot, particularly since the mid-2000s. I see that one of the comments was about the Russian flag planting. That was in 2007. Around the mid-2000s and onwards, interest in the Arctic region really went up exponentially. And this group, they are admitted only with consensus amongst the 8 Arctic states, whom, to varying degrees, depending upon the situation, with consultation with the indigenous peoples. It's worth noting that Iceland doesn't have any indigenous peoples, but the other 7 do. And so this forum, in some ways, is praised quite a lot for really opening up dialogue, particularly with Russia, for really putting indigenous people front and center. But it's also faced some detractors who say that when it comes to following up on some of the key and interesting scientific reports that it's been putting out, first-class research, that it hasn't been then when it goes home to the different individual Arctic states, the ball hasn't really been picked up and run with by the states. And this really comes back to one of the key factors about the Arctic Council and how it is formed. It does not have independent decision-making power. It doesn't have a centralized budget. It doesn't have the means of implementing these agreements on their own, or at least not to any extent that would enable them to, for example, come up with an agreement that allows the Council to infringe on the national sovereignty of any of the original 8 Arctic states. And this has sometimes led to some discussion about whether or not the Arctic Council should evolve into a more of a heavy decision-making body, or whether or not it should stay in its present format. And this is a constant discussion, and certainly something to which there is no easy solution. So that's the Arctic Council.
Thank you, Danita. And I think with that, and also with the comments on the core states, we answered a comment question from Valentin Kondradiev. But looking at some of the other questions and comments we got, I think we need to talk about national interest, because the questions and comments really seem to juxtapose two things. On the one hand, we talk about the environment, we talk about scientific endeavors in the Arctic, we talk about the threats of climate change that the whole world is subject to one way or another, rising sea levels, etc., and fueling some interest in the Arctic through that kind of lens. But then there is also national interest, there are natural resources, there is geopolitical strategic advantage that we're talking about when we talk about the Arctic. So, for example, Dr. Yolanda Spies, she reminded us of the Russian flag planting that, in her words, caused quite a diplomatic furor. And then we have Ambassador Kishan Rana, who asks, when we talk about China's strategy and the environmentalism, or this kind of alternative approach to the West that seems to be attached to that, aren't we falling into the trap of taking language a bit too literally, and isn't it, after all about resources, also for China in particular, a shorter route to Europe and access to the Arctic region's resources? So when we have these two things, like let's call it hard diplomacy, so proper strategic questions about resources, questions about also geopolitical strategic advantage on the one hand, and then we have questions of climate change, scientific exploration, even maybe something like the common heritage of mankind. How do we bring these two things together, and what are your comments and thoughts on these questions and comments? I think I would like to start with André, and then if Paul is still with us, with Paul, and then Danita. But André, because you were talking about China, and that seems to be a hot topic.
Thank you very much, Katerina, and thank you also to Commissioner Kishan Rana for the question. And I am completely agreeing with him that there is exactly this trap, and I'm sorry if I was not clear in the way that I expressed myself. What I was trying to get at is exactly that So China's environmental engagement with the Arctic and China's scientific engagement with the Arctic has to do with increasing influence there to access resources, yes, but also it has to do with the wider ideological struggle with the West that is rising at the moment. So this whole discourse about ecological civilization is not only a cynical discourse that hides China's geopolitical interests, it is also, to a certain extent, it is believed by China's authorities, but it is also part of a growing ideological struggle with the West. And so what my argument was being is that the Arctic itself, even this type of scientific and environmental engagement with the Arctic, is part of that wider discourse and is part of that wider struggle. It is not a neutral type of thing, even though it is frequently portrayed as such. But the very fact that China is already in its white paper using the same type of language, talking about the common, the exact words are the community of shared future of humankind. This type of language is the same language that is used to describe ecological civilization. And ecological civilization is being portrayed within China and increasingly at the level of the UN as well as an alternative to Western liberal environmentalism. So it is an alternative which is not, although it is not portrayed as such by China, it is basically the argument that the type of authoritarian environmentalism is actually a lot more effective in combating climate change than the type of approaches, market-based approaches that the West has followed. So in a way, it is a struggle which has to do with accessing resources, but also it is an ideological struggle. And when I say that ideological, is in the sense of actually gaining legitimacy for China's approach to these things, and gaining legitimacy for China's own internal type of government and internal type of answers to these things, which is a struggle that is actually portraying itself significantly in several spaces around the world, the Arctic not none the least, but also in areas of the world which are usually called developing areas, in which there is actually this increasing struggle between the Chinese model and the Western model of approaches to development, and increasingly also of approaches to environmentalism. So to answer your question, Katerina, I would say that the lesson is that actually we cannot disentangle these two things, right? And we need, on the one hand, to always be aware of the national and geopolitical interest within these discourses. But on the other hand, we should not become too cynical in the sense of thinking that these discourses are purely a mask to hide the geopolitical interests. Many times their promoters actually believe in them, but they are part of wider ideological struggles, which I think is something that is very important to understand about international relations, but which has been people have been paying less attention to that in recent times, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. I think these disentanglements and the question that we can't actually pull it apart to some extent, I think that's a very interesting answer to questions about resources in the Arctic and this kind of race for Arctic resources. And Paul, are you with us?
I think I'm still with you.
Yeah, great. So do you want to address this question of how do we bring together questions of national interest on the one hand, and then questions of scientific exploration in the Arctic and common heritage of mankind and these kind of questions?
So what is mankind? If we think about mankind or humankind as in the Framework Convention on Climate Change, we're talking about all humans on Earth, present and future and past. So one of the observations in these types of discussions, and it goes back to the introduction that Katerina made, was the notion of a debate and different perspectives. And I think really the challenge is a dialogue, looking at where our common interests are. And part of the challenge in this is that we're introduced to information at increasingly shorter timescales. And the challenge is to make sense of it. And part of that is, I think, building on the comment that André made about not being cynical, I think he's absolutely right. There is certainly a lot of juice in the world to be cynical with what's translated into the media and crisscrossing through social media and on the televisions, on the radios, and newspapers and magazines. And I think part of it is to recognize that there are problems that are that exist today between nations. Nations are sovereign entities. They have sovereign rights, sovereign jurisdictions. They have militaries. They are unique unto themselves in terms of national interest. No two nations have the same national interest. They may be allies or adversaries. And so the challenge is to look at the world today and think about the world that we want in the future. And it's not a matter of being hypothetical or scenario oriented. It's just a matter of being practical. And to do that means we have to look back where we've come from. And the observation is that since the Treaty of Westphalia, when the nation state originated, the global human population has increased more than 1,000%. The dynamics of the world are different than when the nation state was created. At the time it was necessary to have sovereignty and sovereign rights and jurisdiction. Today, many cities are more economically powerful than many nations. And the distinction between nations and other jurisdictions in the past, that nations had militaries, today warfare in a sense is asymmetric, with things that can be introduced from people in a basement anywhere in the world. And there isn't a specific address like there was in the past. So it seems to me that the types of solutions that will operate in the world are processes, and the processes are related to ideas. And I think an important idea is that we can all, at individual to global levels, aspire to make informed decisions. And it's, I think, prudent, in the sense of driving down the road, each of us, we have to address the cars around us, and as we're driving down the road, and the circumstances, the one on the left and the one on the right, and the road conditions and the weather conditions. But we also have to be alert to the red lights ahead. We have to think about how to maneuver into the future. And we have to be aware of what's coming behind in our rearview mirrors. And so in a sense, the challenge is to operate across a continuum of urgencies. And what science offers in this discussion is a perspective of time. Time is a most challenging feature. I would, if you talk to the physicists, the people that have the mathematical skills to understand the universe, time is a complicated element. And it's difficult to think in terms of human scale activities in terms of time. And so I think the questions of nationalism and global, I think the intersection is that we live in a globally interconnected civilization. There are jurisdictional and interests and activities and capacities from subnational to national to international scales. And the challenge is to empower next generation thinking to operate in that world.
Thank you. And I think this not just addressed the question of national interest, it also addressed the question of timescales, which is a whole nother debate when we look at the Arctic as kind of short-term political gains versus the longer-term, almost geological time, for example. But for a moment, let's stick with this question of national interest and how it manifests in the Arctic and how we can relate it to other questions related to the Arctic. And I think here I want to bring in Danita again on this kind of question, because I think with your research background you have thought quite a bit on this question of national interest related to the Arctic. So over to you, Danita.
Well, the first thing I'll say is that it is important to remember that when there's this constant talk in the media, or there was a recent article, for example, in National Geographic, where the title was about, a race for resources in Cold War and stuff. These images of, the reigniting of a Cold War and then a pun on words, cold in the Arctic, I mean, they give a certain impression about what is happening in the region, which is not exactly congruent with what is happening. It's important to remember that when we are seeing military exercises and increasing of equipment and things happening in the Arctic region, that sometimes and often these things are related to the fact that there is development happening in the Arctic region and states are just reacting accordingly. Militaries are tools which they can use in order to help with rapid response to immediate issues involving, for example, search and rescue. I think Valentine there mentions that the Arctic Council has, for example, come up with some legally binding agreements. And, you know, the first one was about search and rescue, which is essential and is universal. Oil spills don't respect borders, for example. And so they have acknowledged this. And in many cases, where the Coast Guard and where the military falls into the different countries' jurisdictions varies. In Canada, for example, the Coast Guard is a civilian organization. In Denmark, where I am presently, it's the Navy that takes care of Coast Guard responsibilities. So there are blurred lines. But when we're talking about resources, and which very much hits at this nationalism and heart of national interest and concerns, it is essential to remember that much of the Arctic region is uncontested. Much of the Arctic region falls in recognized national sovereignty boundaries. And that it's really the central Arctic Ocean, which at the moment is predominantly covered in ice. But as Paul says, with climate change and global warming, this is going to become increasingly accessible. And you're seeing moves, for example, as André says, about China in terms of building resources, expressing interest, and talking about developing shipping routes, which China's been very open about this. That's really going to come to the forefront. But again, the Arctic coastal states, which are 5 of the 8 states, which are Canada, the Kingdom of Denmark, the United States because of Alaska, Norway, and Russia, have come together with 5 other key industry players, for example, to deal with Central Arctic fisheries issues, which don't fall in the purview of the Arctic Council, which lie in sort of a murky area of who and what institution is really responsible for helping to deal with these things, because it's the high seas. So you're starting to see more cooperation, more understanding that we don't want to see yet another tragedy of the commons happen there. And so there's a temporary moratorium in place to do scientific research, to make considerations about sustainable development. Is it perfect? Will it last? I don't know. These are all unknowns. But you are seeing a move towards a recognition of the fact that sovereignty is in place in many of these different Arctic countries, in much of the Arctic region, which was unknown in many respects back in 2007 when you had the Russian flag planting, because that's when a whole bunch of misunderstandings and misinformation came out. And a lot of that has been dispelled now. The Arctic Council, for example, through its Twitter account, has gone through quite a bit of effort to put out simple little information statements just to try to educate people about how the Arctic region is divvied up. But it is important to always remember that there are high seas in the Arctic region, that there is an area where there are question marks as to how it's going to emerge into geopolitics. And while there have been efforts, such as with this fisheries moratorium, which came about in the past couple of years, there are still questions about who's going to be responsible for what, how is this going to emerge, is there anything we can do in order to reduce the impact of climate change, and are we actually willing to, as nation states, Arctic and otherwise, to commit to doing the things that need to be done to limit the impact of climate change. And that is a commitment which we hear a lot of dialogue about, the Paris Accord, the Kyoto Accord before that, but will people actually commit? Or are we just going to wait until it's too late? And that's where we're at right now.
Thank you. And I mean, that's a good reminder that there's a lot of work for diplomats to be done, and that there's lots of scope for also non-traditional diplomacy, public diplomacy, soft power, individual scientists, as well as international organizations engaging in this process and also engaging in public diplomacy. So bringing this kind of back to the world of diplomacy, and also keeping in mind that we only have a few minutes left, I would like to give the floor to you for your final remarks, your kind of final reflections on the topic, but also keeping in mind the question from what we've debated today and from your research. What is your advice for diplomacy, for the practice of diplomacy, or for diplomats based on what we discussed? And what is your final word on the topic that you would like to share with us? And I think I would like to go in the same order as before, so André, Paul, and then for final words to Danita. So André, over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, very briefly, just to allow us to engage a bit more in discussion, I would say that the main lesson for diplomats and for people who are learning and engaging with diplomacy is actually the need to understand. And when I say understand, is that I mean understand not only and the Arctic is expressive of this. Understand not only the processes and the competition, because we get too caught up sometimes in competition, as Danita was just mentioning, and actually understand the points of view of several countries, and many times how their approaches to region, namely the Arctic. Definitely, there is a dimension of rhetoric, and there is a dimension of fog screens to hide deeper engagement and deeper geopolitical interests. But also, it is necessary to understand how even those smoke screens are usually in line with the country's wider policies and wider understanding of themselves and of their place in the world. So I would say that it's important for diplomats to be, again, the two dimensions, be constantly aware of this geopolitical and national interest dimension, but also being very much engaged on understanding the other and understanding the world from the other's perspective, understand how the other's policies and approaches to a region are usually framed in their wider concerns and in their wider orientations towards the world. And if I can just ask Danita for that, I mean, to a significant extent, the article that we wrote together actually addresses that, right? Addresses this need to understand how, and she can talk a bit more about that perhaps, this need of how a country's approach to international relations and its understanding of itself influences its foreign policy. So I think we should avoid making the split between the national and geopolitical and the rhetorical, and actually understand how they are together without falling into the rhetoric, but at the same time without being too cynical about it, if that makes sense. I think that would be a good lesson for future diplomats. Thank you.
And really good, really good final word. Over to you, Paul, for some final reflections.
Thank you, Katharina. Thank you, André, and thank you, Danita, for your kind comments and thoughtful words. It's a pleasure and honor to collaborate with you in this discussion. Advice for diplomacy in a general sense. Well, I think we talked about this. The notion of a debate versus a dialogue characterizes the essence of diplomacy. If you're going to debate, the likelihood of achieving common interests is minimized. So the challenge is dialogue. And I'm looking at your WebDebate logo, and of the three colored boxes, there's an intersection. And the intersection is where the common interests are. And the real challenge in this is to operate in a way that enables dialogue, that allows adversaries and allies alike to communicate based on perspectives. And I'm just an individual in this discussion, but I can give you an example, a practical example. When I was at the University of Cambridge, a colleague was at MGIMO University in Moscow. And two professors, proposed to have the first formal dialogue between NATO and Russia regarding security in the Arctic Ocean. We made this proposal for an advanced research workshop on environmental security in the Arctic Ocean. It went to the full NATO-Russia Council in 2009 for approval, and we convened this dialogue at the University of Cambridge, with 4 ministries from Russia and a representative to the president of Russia, the same person, Arturo Chilangarov, that had planted the flag at the North Pole. We had the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. There were ambassadors there. The discussion that is possible to convene with science diplomacy is one of balancing national interests and common interests at a practical level. So this was just two professors at institutions that were able to bring together the first formal dialogue between NATO and Russia regarding security in the Arctic. The The resulting book, Environmental Security in the Arctic Ocean, is available online. I think something on the order of 60,000 downloads of this book since it was written, as a compilation of observations from adversaries and allies alike. We had the oil companies, and we had Shell Oil and the World Wildlife Fund that were sponsors of this, NATO and Russia. All of the Arctic states were represented, 17 nations were involved. The dialogues that are possible with science diplomacy, they are not debates, they are dialogues, and they start with questions. Questions do not have any assumptions about right answers or wrong answers, they're questions. And it is that level of engagement that the opportunity exists best to begin to build common interests. And when there are questions of common concern, it raises the issue of what are the methods to answer those questions. And so begins the process of informed decision making. But I would say as an observation, and in the spirit of diplomacy, with an option without advocacy that can be used or ignored explicitly. So with full respect to you as the decision maker, individually, whoever is out there in the world, the opportunity is to think in terms of building common interests and to identify where the engagement will actually achieve progress in terms of governance mechanisms or built infrastructure at whatever scale. And the challenge we've collectively faced is on a planetary scale. We have to all get this right. It's not something that we can relegate to future generations. It's our responsibility today. So I take with great, as an honor and a privilege, to be able to share opportunities, advice to the audiences I don't know who they are talking to. But I appreciate the initiative by the DiploFoundation, and I appreciate the contributions from Danita and André. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think there's lots of common ground that just emerged throughout the debate between all of the speakers. But last but not least, for some final words, over to Danita.
Thank you very much. So my suggestion, well, it was raised as one of the questions about the working groups. And the working groups are sometimes described as the workhorses of the Arctic Council. And throughout my research, I have gotten the opportunity through the EU, through the Marie Curie, but also through the Carlsberg Foundation, to travel around the Arctic, to speak to many people who have represented either their peoples or their states. And many of these individuals have had a lot of work to do in the working groups. And one of the key concerns that was raised was about people who have worked in working groups, but also the task forces, and working on these world-class scientific reports. But then after years of work and a lot of money and resources and time, they're not being followed up. And so this isn't necessarily just on the shoulders of any individual diplomats. This goes higher. This goes to the states. This goes to international institutions that do work on environmental concerns, that do work on various different aspects which are being touched upon in the Arctic region, and which have vital importance for other parts of the world too. And so my big call would be for people to go back and to revisit the work that the Arctic Council and that other forums have been doing to help to generate the data needed in order to make informed decisions, and to take that information more into account when we go forward, so that way we don't waste one's time and resources doubling up and redoing work that has already been done simply because we've taken these world-class reports and simply put them on the shelf. So go back and revisit the work and use that work to make informed decisions going forward, so we can advance the diplomatic dialogue and that we can advance diplomacy in the Arctic region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danita. So basically, the only thing I have left to do is to thank our three speakers for sharing their perspective, for advancing our knowledge and thinking about the Arctic, and for giving us, well, concrete advice, but also inspiration for diplomatic practice, the work of diplomats, further scholarship that is needed in that area as well. So thank you, André. Thank you, Danita. Thank you, Paul. It has been an absolutely excellent debate, and I think there are many, many issues we could go into greater depth, many issues we should follow up. As a first step, we will follow up with the summary of this web debate, and we will follow up by posting the recording of the debate. And that will be a first step to keep this dialogue going, because there were so many interesting things on non-traditional diplomacy, public diplomacy, so many avenues that could be followed up from here, which I'm sure you will do in your research, and which I'm sure we will be able to feed into our discussions and into our online courses. So thank you for that. And with that, let me close the debate or discussion for today. Thank you so much.